Konnichiwa everybody, welcome back. I don't know why it took me so long to make this video really, but here we are. The greatest game ever made, bar none. Yes, it's Outrun. My favourite game of all time. So I just thought, I don't know why, it just came into my head, I'm going to do a video about Outrun. So obviously, I'm sure you've all played it. Made by Yu Suzuki for Sega back in 1986. It got released in the arcade. And I've been sort of hero worshipping the game ever since really, to be honest. It just, I don't know what it is, I can't put my finger on it necessarily, I can't tell you in words, I just love it. It's everything about it, the way it plays, the way it looks, the way it sounds, I absolutely love it. And it's, I mean, it's a traditional game, racing game really, arcade racer, but it's got like non-linear gameplay because you've got branching paths and you can choose the route you get from the start to the finish basically. So that was kind of revolutionary at the time really, where you get a choice of which you went left or right at the end of the level. It's, like I say, it's got the most amazing soundtrack. It's just the best game music ever made for me. It was actually written by a guy called Hiroshi Kawaguchi. I'm sure he's done other great work. He did other work for Sega before this, but this is the pinnacle of all music for me. It's absolutely amazing. Whether you choose Passing Breeze, Splash Wave or Magical Sound Shower, they're all stunning in their own right, but it was always Magical Sound Shower for me. When it came out in '86, there was 4 different cabinets. There was 2 different stand-up cabinets, like uprights, and then there were 2 sit-down cabinets, as far as I'm aware. The super deluxe hydraulic one being the absolute pinnacle. I think it used to be about, I can't remember now if it was 50p or £1 a go at the time, which was like a lot of money when you could play the upright for 20p a credit. So consequently I used to play the upright a lot more than I did the hydraulic one, purely because I'd get more credits. But the hydraulic sit-down cab is epic. If I could win the lottery, boy, that would be top of my list. Going back to the game itself, it had a specific arcade board created for it that was apparently at the time, which was based on the System 16 board, but it was specifically a bespoke thing for Outrun to run on it, the one that was in the game eventually. And of course it was one of Sega's sprite scaling games. Loads of epic games in the same sort of sprite scaling genre. And they're all great in their own right, but the pinnacle for me is Outrun. And of course, way back in '86 when I got addicted to the arcade, every holiday, it's all I wanted to do was play on the Outrun cab. I'd play other stuff briefly, but the money I had, 95% of it went into the Outrun cab. And that love affair has lasted 35, it's more than that now actually, 37 years is it now, since it came out to now. And the love's just as strong now as it was back then. Of course, back in the day, you needed the arcade at home, but you couldn't have that obviously, so you were relying on ports to whatever computer or system you had available to you. So of course, at the time I had a Spectrum, so I couldn't wait for the game to get converted to the 8-bit micros, in particular the Spectrum version, which of course it did eventually by US Gold. And obviously I'd been used to playing the arcade and I couldn't wait to play it on my Speccy. And well, it didn't quite live up to the arcade, if I'm honest. But the great thing was, it obviously came with 2 tapes, but it also got the audio soundtrack on a cassette as well. So once you'd loaded the game up, you could actually play the arcade music on your cassette player. You just loaded the game on, and then at least it sounded like the arcade, even though it realistically didn't play much like it. I will be putting some footage up here so you'll see the different sort of versions I'm going to run through that all got released, and you know, you can see for yourself how that turned out. I mean, there was awesome detail on the car for the Spectrum version, and some of the scenery, to be fair, but of course it was all monochrome, but it ran so slow, it untrue really. At the time, you know, it was all I'd got, so I loved it, but obviously with hindsight it really wasn't a great version, but nevertheless I was desperate for it at the time and I absolutely loved it. Of course then it did get at the same time get released on the other 8-bit micros, which were obviously the Commodore 64. Now I've had that in the past when I had my Commodore, but I've since sold my Commodore, so I've not got that game anymore. At the time I had the Commodore much later than the Spectrum, and in many ways the Commodore is better than the Spectrum because you know, it's at least full colour and it moves along at a decent lick, but I mean, it's not a very good game of Outrun, to be honest, as again you will see. It's quite drab colours as you'd expect from the C64. But I mean, at the time it was alright really, you know. They were what they were, the 8-bit micro ports. They've all got their compromises. Then of course there was also the Amstrad version. Again, I haven't got an Amstrad anymore. I used to have one, but for some reason I kept the game for the Amstrad. Obviously it looks exactly the same as the Spectrum box, but I've also got the disc version for the Amstrad because I used to have the 6128. Again, I don't know why I kept them really. They might not work, possibly. I can't remember now, it's been that long since I sold it. But anyway, yeah, the Amstrad kind of was a mix of the two, the Spectrum and the Commodore, in that it was beautiful colour graphics and it was quite detailed, much more so than the Commodore, much more in line with the Spectrum, though not as accurate to the arcade as the Spectrum. But again, it didn't play particularly well. So at this point there was really no decent way of playing it other than playing the arcade machine. So then time went on, and let's just get that back on. Yeah, time went on and I eventually sold my Spectrum and got a Master System. So of course the first game I wanted as soon as it was available on the Master System was Outrun, and this was like a giant leap forward at the time, if I'm honest. I just, you know, spent hours and hours playing it because it seemed so much better than the Spectrum. It was lovely full colour graphics, it moved along nicely, it played kind of like the arcade. Well, it did play like the arcade, it just didn't quite look as nice as the arcade. I've mentioned this in other videos, with hindsight I don't think this has aged particularly well, but at the time it was a stunning game of Outrun, to me at least, back in whenever this was. I had this 88, not 87 maybe, something like that. I don't know when it came out on the Master System actually. 87 I think, so it probably was 87. But at the time it was a good version and I really enjoyed it. Then of course I was constantly moving forward. I wanted the latest thing, as we all did at the time, if you lived through these awesome times. And of course then it got released on the I should say actually, as in addition to the Master System, it also came out on the Game Gear. I don't have the physical version of that anymore. Again, I sold my Game Gear collection ages ago. It's not very good, if I'm honest. I'll put a little clip up of the Game Gear running, but I don't think it's a patch on the Master System, if, in all honesty. I mean, normally that can be the same as the Master System game, but in this instance, I don't think it's as good. But then obviously, things started getting released on 16-bit formats, which they've been made available, obviously, on the Amiga and the ST, first of all. And this is the Amiga version on the Kicks label, I think. No, sorry, Classics label. Now, I did play the Atari ST version. My cousin had an Atari ST, and from memory, it's very similar to this Amiga version. Now, again, it obviously looked quite nice in terms of being, you know, bright and colourful compared with the Spectrum version I'd initially played and had when that came out. But I think when you compare it to the Master System, it's quite poor. Not a good version of Outrun in my opinion. And as I say, the ST version is very similar from memory. But I will put a bit of footage up of this, but it plays terrible. So, I mean, I couldn't recommend buying this. Play it by all means if you can, by emulation. But I don't think it's a good version of Outrun, in all honesty. However, because I've got an Amiga, I had to have it. Then of course things started getting a lot more serious, and once I'd got the Mega Drive, obviously I wanted the Mega Drive version, and things were stepped up on the Mega Drive, if I'm honest. And at the time, this was a really, really good version. I think certainly the best to date that I've certainly played at home, and absolutely loved it. This is obviously the Japanese version. I had the English version to start with back in the day, but although it's not as good as it once was, I do think it's still a decent game of Outrun. I mean, it's a massive step up from the Master System. It's much closer to the sort of arcade original than the Master System is, and it's certainly better than all the 8-bit micro ports and the 16-bit computer ports, in my opinion. At the time, I think this was a stellar version, and it still plays pretty decent. It's just not as good as it once was. Then, around the same time, I can't remember precisely, it may even, I don't know which one I had first. I think it was the Mega Drive, that's why I've done that first. But however, around a similar time, I got the PC Engine version. And now this, obviously, the PC Engine is more of an 8-bit system than a 16-bit system, but this is a stunning version, I've got to say. It blows the mind it's on an 8-bit system, because it's so good. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not as good as the arcade, but for what it's running on, it is a stunning version and still plays fantastically well. There's no screenshots on a PC Engine box. It's a great game. Thoroughly recommend that to anybody. If you've got a PC Engine, you must play Outrun on it. It's still a great version to this day, in my opinion. And it was, I think of the two, I'd prefer to play that over the Mega Drive version now, if I'm honest. Both good as they are, I think the PC Engine shades it quite easily over the Mega Drive, to be honest. Right, the next version I think I had in the timeline was the version for the Game Boy Advance, which is on the Sega Arcade Gallery cart. Now again, at the time, it was fantastic for, you know, it was the first time, aside from the Game Gear version, that you could play Outrun on a handheld, but this one felt much more like the original arcade game than, you know, the Game Gear one did. It still plays reasonable, I'd say. Obviously it's got its limitations, but I do think it's still a decent game of Outrun, considering it's running on a Game Boy. It's pretty good, and certainly one to check out if you've got a Game Boy and you like Outrun. It's not going to blow your socks off anymore like it perhaps once did, but it is still a good conversion for what it's running on. Then I think the next thing was when, actually I'm going to go slightly off the timeline here. We'll stick with, I don't know. No, we'll stick with the timeline. So things then got as good as they ever got, because we got the Saturn version. And for me, this is the greatest way to play Outrun. If you haven't got the arcade cab, obviously, that's the best way to do it. This version is stunning. And it's still the best version to this day, in my opinion. It plays exactly like the arcade machine. All the graphics are right, the sound's right. It's epic. I mean, you can get this is the Japanese version, obviously. You can get the PAL version on Sega Ages, and I think it's fairly cheap, to be honest. It's a must-buy, in my opinion. It's stunning. So, really, that was the pinnacle. That then felt like the arcade at home. And since then, obviously, there have been other versions. All in their own way fantastic. However, I don't think any of them are quite as good as the Saturn version. So after that, we then got the Dreamcast version, which this is part of what's on Yu Suzuki Gameworks, as I've shown in a pickups video if you've watched it. But basically, yeah, you've got the Saturn version. Sorry, you've got the Outrun on this Yu Suzuki Gameworks for the Dreamcast. It's fantastic, but I don't think it's quite as good as the Saturn, in my opinion. But it's still, you know, it's still an epic way to enjoy the game if that's what you've got, you know, at your disposal. It's an epic conversion of it. And then, of course, you've got the 3DS version. Now this, there's no physical cart for this, so it's a download code. So again, this is a fantastic version, and again, in terms of being handheld gaming, this is probably the best way to play it, because it's far superior to the Game Boy Advance version. You've also got the 3D feature on the 3DS, should you want to use it that way, but like I say, it's an epic version. It's just a car that's not right. It's not the Ferrari, but obviously there's licensing issues, so you can understand why it's different. But that's all I can say against it, really. Other than that, it's an absolutely epic version of Outrun. Then, of course, you've got the last version, I suppose, to come out, which is on the Switch, which is what we've got running here. Again, and much like the 3DS, it's a fantastic version. It's just that the car isn't a Testarossa like it should be. But I mean, it's tiny gripes, but compared with the Saturn version, it's still phenomenal. It's an amazing game and a must download for the Switch, in my opinion. But for the perfectionist out there, it's not as good as the Saturn for that reason, in my opinion. All of these obviously pale into the shade compared with the experience of playing the arcade original. There's nothing quite like it. It's always going to be my sort of number one game. It's always going to be my favourite. It's always going to be the thing I would love to buy if I won the lottery. The sit-down hydraulic cab, it would just be epic. To be honest, I'd settle for the stand-up cab, really, but I'm never going to own either. But overall, it's just I love the game. I can't, like I said before, I can't explain how much I love it. It's whatever floats your boat, isn't it? It don't matter what your favourite game is, if it means something special to you, for whatever reason. It's just the way it makes you feel, and it's just epic. And if we've all got one like that, we're all living a happy life, really, in my opinion. But this will always be my number one version. This is the one you want to play, and this is just gaming perfection, gaming nirvana. If you could only play one game for the rest of your life, for me it would be this. And if the collection had to go, and I could keep one thing, it would be the Saturn and this game. Technically two things, I suppose, but you know what I mean. If I could only keep one game, it would be this, hands down, without fail. That's Outrun on the Saturn. And that's it, really. Obviously, things, you know, things came out afterwards. People tried to sort of emulate it. Sega themselves brought out similar, you know, and more advanced games in times that followed. You know, there was Turbo Outrun, for instance. There was Outrunners. Both great games in their own right, but neither of them have got the magic and majesty of the original Outrun for me. There's something about it. I think when the true sequel came out, Outrun 2, that did recapture the magic, and that is equally good in many ways, and it's only a tiny step down from this in my sort of estimations and my love of, you know, all things racing games. Outrun 2 is just slightly below Outrun 1, but you know, it's close. It was a stellar attempt at recapturing Outrun. It would be epic if they did an Outrun 3 one day. Will they ever? I'm not convinced, if I'm honest. It doesn't seem as though Sega can punch their way out of a wet paper bag to me. But one day, we live in hope. But in the meantime, there'll always be Outrun to play, and I'll be forever grateful for Mr. Suzuki, or Suzuki-san, and his small team developing it back in '86, and it becoming the most special game to me, and remaining so 37 years later. All hail Outrun. I hope you found that enjoyable. Let me know what your favourite game is, or let me know what you think of Outrun. It's not for everybody, obviously, but I love it. Thanks for watching anyway, and I hope to see you soon. Sign off.